So, Alan Gordon, John Sarno, two authors. Alan Gordon, I was referencing in the videos that I released right before this video. I referenced the research, the scientific research that talks about pain is fear. And then Alan Gordon is the author that I didn't remember during that video. I went and looked it up because I had read his book years ago, near the time that I read John Sarno's book, Dr. John Sarno, another person that I referenced in those videos. When I read Alan Gordon, so Alan Gordon says that pain is fear. Dr. Sarno, he's the one that broke from the kind of the medical establishment, and what he thought was a fairly low success rate, I think, with chronic pain, the treatment of chronic pain. That's what his specialty was. He broke from them and started treating it as it's really an emotional issue. It's actually repressed anger or fear, or other emotions. Put the two and two together, you might say, well, which one is it? But it's all fear, because anger, repression is fear. It doesn't feel safe to feel or express this. Safe to feel or express this. It doesn't feel that way with repression. Safe refers to I'm afraid. Nervous system, basically. Not just trauma. I think in some circles everything gets put on the ego. It's the ego doing everything. Other circles it's like it's all trauma. I mean, in terms of the what is this mechanism we're talking about? Fear is pain, and anger repression or fear repression is behind pain. Is that trauma, in other words, or is there something else? Everybody thinks it's always one thing. It feels to me like it's a combination of, whatever language you bring to it. It's, yes, trauma, of course. These are conditioned, often trauma responses from childhood, especially the repression part. Because repression, as they've studied in the science, is connected to trauma. Trauma is like, when I say that word, I mean like the things that happen to you, basically. That where impactful things happen to you, but you didn't know how to because you didn't have conscious parents, you didn't have people there with you to co-regulate, but also more just conscious parents, not just about regulation, but conscious parents. We just didn't have them. So as a result, or whatever other trauma happened, whatever happened to us, then what's connected to that is the repression of emotion. There's Sarno. But also, from a spiritual standpoint, the ego talk, you could say that there is no self. It's like a mechanism or an activity, and part of the activity, well, most all of the activity is unconscious at first, because we're people who, at least we think we are, decide for whatever reason to investigate this question of who am I in spirituality. And as we take that question deeper, we see actually in direct experience, not as an idea, not as just another belief system, that in direct experience there's no self. That's what the non-dual teachings are about. With that language, you could just say, well, it's the ego, this mechanism that they're talking about. I'll try to clear it up in a second, but in other words, that self-contraction that holds itself back, or is fighting for survival, or to be right, or whatever, the ego mechanism. And I would say most good teachings will say that ego mechanism is a body-mind mechanism, and it kind of held in the body, even visceral. And so awakening is, as that energetic contraction releases, there's no self. So these are spiritual terms, but the programming of self, much of it very deeply unconscious, like trauma and repression, is, you could say, well, you could use that framework. Okay, so it's in spiritual terms, it's the ego. Self-contraction, fine. In scientific terms, they talk about trauma, repression, or clinical terms. It's all the same, really. And what Alan Gordon and John Sarno are talking about, in my view, is the same thing too. People use different languages, but when you let go of the frameworks, we use these frameworks, these books, these ways of thinking to inform us in some way. But in the end, we have to verify, don't we? In some way, can't we verify what all these different disciplines and authors are saying? If we can't verify it somehow in our experience, or create some practice or inquiry that helps us with these issues, then, it just doesn't go far enough, does it? Anyway, the way I see it is they're all saying the same thing in different language. And as I said in those videos, it's a great time to be alive because these things are coming together now, I think more than ever. So, but back to, in other words, what's going on in the world, and no matter how you slice it or how you define it, we're becoming more aware of the human operating system, really, I think, no matter what we call it. And we're seeing that different disciplines are actually finding similarities, and science and spirituality are, I think, really mirroring each other in a lot of ways, especially at the quantum level. So, wow, we have still a lot to discover because we have these great authors and these ideas, and then on all the research recently about which backs Sarno up, that says, yes, indeed, anger repression, fear repression is linked to chronic pain and illness. And then we have, I cited the study earlier, but there are other studies that indicate that the fear is a big part of pain. The question, though, is when it comes to practice, that's what it is. It boils down to that. What does all this mean for the purpose of practice? In my whole time as a spiritual aspirant or teacher, it's always been about that experiential for me. I like reading these things, but if they don't have any practical application in my life, it's probably an escape of some kind, is the way I've seen it. And I have a great history of escaping through all sorts of things, addiction and otherwise. And so this aspect of my life has been all about experience. So what I love about Sarno and Alan Gordon is that it looks like two different things that they're talking about. And when I first picked it up, I read Gordon's book and I read Sarno's books. And I remember putting Gordon's books down and not researching that line of thinking much. I intuitively thought he's onto something, but I didn't have the experiential, the practice there at all. I didn't have the skill to access what he was talking about, but I understood it. I mean, he's really talking about something very unconscious, which is there's a fear response that's coming, a safety program is what I call it, that comes to meet pain. It's the way that, it's almost like the way that we're attending to pain is part of the pain. We said that before. Buddhists will say, like, your resistance to the pain is the pain. But I think we're really, really seeing it now. And we break it down the way that Gordon does to fear. It's just like our nervous system is designed to detect a threat. How wonderful is that? I mean, we could not have survived in the way that we have without this. And that's really what our nervous system is good at, is detecting threat. The issue is that it detects threats where there aren't any, a lot of times. And so that's where these teachings and these methods come in, is to see through these threats that aren't real, that are in our consciousness, that come from trauma or identification. Gordon and Sarno seem to be talking about two different things at first to me, because I didn't have the experience. I didn't have the direct experience yet, and that aspect of my own unconscious, to be able to pull those two things together. But intuitively I knew that Gordon was right, just because of resistance is a topic that we always talk about in non-duality. He's essentially talking about that. Resistance to pain, and you can also just, by extension, that's also just resistance to discomfort and contraction or tightness and self-contraction. It's very relevant, but it was only intuitive. It wasn't really deeply grokked at that time. So I put it down, and then I went down the Sarno route because that resonated with me. I don't think I could understand at the time that I read Gordon how to apply KI to what Gordon was saying, frankly. I just did not, it didn't come to me. But with Sarno, because we have reverse inquiry in the Killer Bee inquiries, with Sarno it seemed more intuitive to be able to prompt up the anger repression command. If there's something in my nervous system that is holding back anger, I should be able to prompt that up. And of course, I was able to, and then we have the work now that works. Okay, so that's the two doors I talked about in the video. So I essentially went down the second door first. This might get confusing to you. What I call the first and second door, these are completely made up concepts. So don't reify them. I'm not intending them like there's actual doors or something, or like divided compartments of our experience, because there really are no divisions in these are just concepts that point to experience that we can each verify for ourselves. The first door I'm referring to again is how our nervous system detects threats, and is when we're in practice, when we start to actually discover inquiry or awareness, for example, or meditation, we encounter, or what appears to awareness, are challenging energies, emotions, sensations, pain, contraction, along with thoughts, obviously, and emotions. But the way that we relate to the somatic stuff, the emotions and sensations, is that as we start meditative practices or awareness practices, we might find resistance there. Simple as that. It took me a while to get that out, but just resistance. And that's the word that you hear in spirituality a lot, is that, oh, I feel like I'm resisting something here. But when you break that down, and that's what I'm calling the first door, that's what Gordon is talking about. And I like Gordon's terms on that rather than the spiritual term resistance, because he's talking about fear, and because these are awareness practices, fear is closer to direct experience for me than some other concept would be. You see what I mean? Because we all know what fear means. We know what it feels like, mostly. And it's a common phrase. And we're all aware of human fear. And the ego is fear. So what Gordon was saying was intuitively making sense. That's the first door. Now I know, I see that in my own experiences. I've seen that. That's the first door, which is resistance to the pain or the contraction that we discover. These are sensations, not emotions yet. We'll talk about that in a second. Sensations that feel dense. It's the body. And in different areas of the body feel more contracted or dense than other areas, usually, in practice. Or one area of the body, like the so-called body, because in awareness it's just energy. But for example, the heart area can open. That's an actual energetic opening, and that happens. It's not just a spiritual idea. There's an opening. And so let's say that happens. Then it becomes even more obvious, the self-contraction, because that's open. Some of it is, and then it becomes obvious because the other areas that are dense or contracted, they kind of come to the surface, or they're more obvious because the heart area is more open. Warm, loving, open, translucent, not contracted, for example. So we learn on the path, even if we didn't realize that this is what it was going to come to, as we awaken, we see that it's a full mind-body affair. It's not just the mind. The body's definitely involved. This is why heart opening and gut opening and embodiment have been talked about. It's also why chakras are talked about, I think, and yoga is very somatic, and traditional Advaita understood the somatic piece of things. I also think Buddhism does too, at the higher levels, like form is none other than formlessness. Formlessness is none other than form. They're including completely the level of form, body. Okay, that's the first door, is I don't want to feel this. Is how I say it. I don't want to feel this. Now, that's not a conscious thought. That's just the tagline I'm giving to this command that is arising, that is there unconsciously. It's not arising when we're coming down in a meditative or an awareness to feel something. We might call it resistance or something like that. But let's talk about it in terms of fear. The nervous system detects threats. So if there's a sensation of some kind, the mind, or if you want to say brain, but let's just say mind, or the nervous system, responds as you start to feel something. It's like, oh, this is a threat. Now, you might not hear those words. You probably wouldn't. And you probably wouldn't hear the words safe. You might, if you were listening, something about that. But it's more like a signal almost. It's resistance. It's an intelligent signal, because that signal it only comes up when appropriate, at least to the nervous system, like when there's a perceived threat. It doesn't just come up when you're just resting in open space, meditative awareness. And that's why I think people like those experiences, because in there they can just rest as that which is not detecting anything. But in real life, I mean, when we get off the mat or whatever, these things happen, they arise, these forms, and we feel them. And so we can actually discover them in meditation again too. We don't, or inquiry, they're there. If we don't just rest as nothing all the time and explore the level of form. Okay, so first door is fear, in the sense that the nervous system is looking to detect a threat. It finds one as you begin to feel a sensation that doesn't feel so comfortable, mind says, or nervous system. There's a signal kind of going on, really. That's the best thing I could say, but it's intelligent. It actually can form in words. With KI, we're learning how to form it in words when appropriate, to help the energy of that to come forth more. But it's a really, really unconscious mechanism. That's the first door. And then we're learning how to work with a mind-body connection with regard to that sensation. As I said so many times, there's a mind part of this. So we're working with the threat that's being detected for the mind-body system, essentially nervous system, in inquiry. Why is that helpful? Because the second door is what essentially is contained in that. That's not a great word, but this pain or this contraction is what the science is saying. And Sarno, this is anger repression. This is trauma imprinting, and it's also just the contraction of being human, because I'm going to say something about that in a second, or being a mammal, maybe. But trauma. This is the second door. This is the emotional stuff, the trauma imprinting, the repression that we have to hold back, the commands to hold back, the emotions to stay safe, and all the imprinting, the memories that we've buried away. I've often said that pain or contraction is like a trash can. Everything we don't want to feel or think about or feel or process unconsciously, or even somewhat consciously, repression or suppression, we throw it in the trash can. It goes in the trash can and it's there. Now it's pain or contraction. So the second door are the emotional issues associated with that contraction. If we have difficulty feeling into it because of the threat detector, that's door one, Alan Gordon, we were obviously going to have, some of us, difficulty getting to the emotional issues that we've avoided and that are not met, that have now hardened into our bodies. And that's what we know now about our bodies. Frisky flesh is the term that I use to, the discovery, whether you like it or not. You wake up and you recognize, if you explore it all, that the body is keeping the score. There's data there. It's not just, the body's not just an appendage that's just being operated completely up here. There's data, there's information stored throughout us, our bodies. This information is really, a lot of it is about fear. And a lot of it are these two doors. So essentially the threat detection system, that programming is there. And of course many other things, but all the trash can stuff is there. The commands of the nervous system to hold certain things back is there. This obviously is the deeper freedom, because these are the unconscious control mechanisms. This is the stuff that really makes people sick. Because we now know, obviously, because I've been saying it. I keep saying obviously because I keep saying it, and you already know it by now. These issues that are first emotional, trauma and repression, turn into physical seemingly physical issues, pain and illness. That's what I mean by everything coming together. And then you have Gordon and that research saying, yeah, part of fear, I would say, or the way I would say, one way to look at the pain is that we're afraid to feel it. And there's a lot that goes with that, just that first door, because there, if we're not feeling into it and exploring it, like getting into the second door, chances are we're having to manage that and using resources. This is why a new model of recovery, I think, got developed, is when people start to explore this, let's see, how do I say this? You have to learn to resource when you're doing deep somatic work. Resourcing, because this is your threat detector, your nervous system. So as you go into this, if you don't do it skillfully, you can pull up some energies that are strong, and you have to have skill or some capacity to be with that, or it can be too much for a while. Most people, there's a state that they get in if they're not skillful, and it doesn't last very long. But the point is we now know that you actually have to expose into awareness these commands, this information, the unconscious material. You have to expose it to awareness in a way that is manageable enough so you're never overwhelmed. But you have to make the unconscious conscious for anything to change in that area. And the problem is that because these doors are locked, let's talk about that. That's why I call them locked. This to me is what I call the great non-dual bypass, simply because it's not being fully talked about. It's hinted at, and some teachings will go into embodiment for sure, but I think this is something that we should all be paying attention to now in 2022 and beyond. The relation, there's literally no dividing line between the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. If non-duality means anything, it has to mean that. And then how does that translate to changes in the way that we look at all this? Is Sarno and Gordon, they've pulled things together for us and others. Now we can take this to experience. So what people are doing in the members area is they're working with those two doors. Many of them come from a history of practice or traditions or life experiences that have primed them for that understanding of these two doors, because these two doors explain a lot of bypassing. Actually, it's not even bypassing. This is what I want in new model. We just say, look, if we're not going to deal with this stuff that's creating pain, contraction, illness, suffering, if we're not really going to deal with it directly, then we have to distract ourselves, don't we? I mean, we have to feel better somehow or manage somehow, whether we do it with fentanyl or we do it with meditation. Something has to happen if we're not going to explore that, because that doesn't go away. And the science is telling us now that is what is behind some, not all. Probably more than we'd like to believe, though, I think. Illnesses, mental health issues, relationship issues, too. Pitfalls and issues on the spiritual path also. So that's what I want to talk about. The people that come to KI, I think they have to listen to it for a while, but they hear the two doors because they know that they have a history of, some have a history of being an addiction, for example. That's their distraction, if you will. Some have a history of being interested in spiritual awakening, but using spiritual practices somewhat, obviously, to avoid feeling. It's so using practice as a resource to regulate your nervous system instead of really deconstruct and deprogram this ego mechanism. The deep strands of it in the body. I mean, so not disembodied practices that they were involved in, and I was too, to some degree. So these people understand that. But if you can just see the two doors, it does explain a lot of so-called bypassing, but it's innocent. There's no judgment, really. When you look at what's happening, is that there's a strong safety program within us. If you translated that nervous system command, it basically says, I don't want to feel. And that's the nature of the ego. The the mechanism, there's a safety thing right there. There's fear driving that. I don't want to feel. That's scary. That's scary. And that's going on whether we like it or not. If there's still this programming, or whether we even admit it or not. And it's showing up as things that don't look like that. It's showing up as pain and illness. And that's why we get away with, I think, blinding ourselves to it. Oh, I did, at least. These two doors explain a lot of bypassing, in my view, because we've been, so many of us, distracting ourselves in so many different ways, wanting to go deeper, but scared, actually, because of the first door. This is threatening to the nervous system on a very unconscious level. It stops us from happening. From it happening. We call it the repression barrier, actually. We put a name on it so that people will start to recognize that they're stopping in order to turn away from this aspect of experience, even though this is what is behind a lot of it. They're turning away. We all do. So to talk about the first door is to help them understand and see how they've been turning away, but also to say, turning away is part of life. Like, distraction and resistance is also just part of it. And have compassion and non-judgment for when you bump up against that wall of that first door. You don't want to feel, you don't want to explore your body because the threat detecting system is in charge there. Even if you give other reasons for it, because I think what we're finding is that this is the stuff that's really in control underneath things, No matter what we say up here, what stories we tell up here, spiritual or otherwise, really. But it's fascinating stuff, and just talking about this stuff, I feel like alive because it feels so true in my experience. It feels the energy already streaming in my experience, and when I talk about it, the possibilities, the potential for this is amazing. Anyway, back to reality here, so to speak. The first door explains a lot of bypassing. People come in and they start to see it. Well, I didn't even want to go past the first door. I didn't want embodiment. What? No, my teacher didn't talk about that. The unconscious? Huh? That's something for psychology? No. So we just fog out over it in different ways. But when people come to KI, it's like they've already exhausted all the other ways, and they try every way around it, and now it's time to come to the first door and more skillfully and really see from awareness what's going on. Pull up that unconscious material instead of just being run by it. There's emotional stuff there. It's fear, basically, that stops you from starting, basically. And even when you start to recognize that embodiment is a real process that we go through, that doesn't mean you're just going to be like, yeah, bring it on. Like, I want to feel everything. It's not like that at all. Because we repress, we hold down, we hold back. These mechanisms are operating. So we meet a resistance along the way, even if we become open. The resistance is the wall. The wall is not real. It's just the word that I'm using. It's just this mechanism. Still door number one. In other words, it wants to keep shutting us out, so to speak, because it's protecting us. And the crazy thing is that there is no self. Someone said, like, 99% of your problems are about a self, and there isn't one. And I thought, that's only scratching the surface. Who was it that said that? That's only scratching the surface. Because your entire nervous system is being run as if there is a self that needs to survive in a way, and there isn't one. Like, all the way down through the data of your body is running as if, and that's for survival. And if you think about it in survival terms, it makes more sense. I think it does. Of course, we had to have operating systems like this in order to survive. It wouldn't have worked any other way. But unfortunately, our threat detecting system has gotten sort of hijacked. The operating system, I think, needs an upgrade. Is really means awaken and embody this. When I first, I'll come back to that. Door number 2 is also the stuff that shows us the bypassing, but that's the stuff I talk about all the time here. So I get on, my face gets on here, and you guys hear me talk about repression all the time, and so I'm not going to go deeply into door number 2, but that's the trauma and the repression. If you don't like those terms, we can find different terms, but essentially this energy that I'm calling emotions, fear, anger, sad, guilt, shame, joy, anything that can arise as an energy like that, even sexual stuff, urges, desires, wants, any and all of that can be suppressed or repressed. We now know that from the science. We also know it from our experience with KI, because we're actually discovering those repression mechanisms, those commands at that second door level, which are also fear. And this is where, because again, holding back anger, holding back joy is because we're trying to stay safe, trying to protect ourselves, or maybe get love, but something, it's usually fear again. I'm afraid to feel and express anger. Completely unconscious. Really, really unconscious. Even if you're intellectually aware of that, it's not enough. It is not enough to be intellectually aware that you repress anger or some other emotion, or that you have trauma. It is not, at this stage, for you to believe that. There's no support for it. There's just none. Not in the therapy world or anywhere else. Really. I mean, maybe in the therapists who aren't somatic based, but so these explain the bypasses, because the emotional repression is also a lot of the stuff that drives us on the search, or the trauma, the emotional issues, basically, that stuff. Because it's also ego identity at that level. There are programs around that command us to identify with really core programming at that level, like I'm disgusting, I'm wrong, I'm bad. Those programs are also stored in those areas, and that's impacting our life, obviously, because there is no self, and it's being created, and the self that's being created is unlovable, not good enough. That's the false ego. All of that's happening in that second door, and it's locked away from us by the first door first, because I don't want to do that. I don't want to feel that. That unconscious nervous system command is running the show. I almost get a visual of like when you're on the enlightenment path, and on the path, it's like you just think there's a self. Like, I'm real, there's a real self here. And then you have that shift to awareness, either suddenly or gradually, recognizing that you're not that stuff that's coming and going. A real shift in that seeing happens. And you can actually have it right now if you stop and look, that words, pictures, feelings, and sensations are coming and going, but the awareness that sees them, or that to which they're registered, isn't coming and going. That's the recognition. I don't want to say it's oversimplified, but that's the whole non-dual pointing there. That, in some ways, even though that's an actual realization for sure. I mean, it can be very, what's the word, like fully embodied, or just kind of glimpsed at, or there but not really stabilized in that at different degrees. It's not just one or the other. It's not like black and white. That's my experience with people through the years. It just isn't black and white. But that aspect of the path, if it's not fully embodied right away, and it would be really rare for all your stuff to just be seen as for what it is. All of it. I mean, all the way down. That is rare, as Adya says, to suddenly have that shift. And so most of the teachers on the earth, then, I would suffice to say most of them didn't have that shift, and most of them are in some sort of embodiment process. But they wouldn't necessarily tell you that. Maybe they would, some would. The point being is, I think that can also be seen from an ego standpoint, is like that's the finish line on the path. All the time that you're seeking is like, there's a self here, and in the moment when you see that there isn't one here, it's like to the still ego that's still running in the background, that can be the thing that says, well, now I've made it. In the finish line, like all that time, and now it's seen. And then you'll say, but I don't identify with that. But actually you do. Because that ego activity has momentum to it. It doesn't just like a faucet turn off because you had this powerful realization. The mind likes to interpret. It just does that. And it'll interpret the experience in a way that makes that realization like the end game. And because so you can sort of hold up and say, no, you can't go beyond me. I've gone as deep as you can go. And that would be ego. When we drop that, whatever that is, and we recognize now, what we've recognized here is that which we've always sought. And so, yeah, we can just rest as that. And there's a lot of that happens because it feels so complete. Just nowness is just fun. That's fundamental to my experience. It's just presence. But here is when we go into really, really looking at doors 1 and 2. That's the embodiment. The good thing is you can start that early on. So if you hear me now, even if you're with a teacher and that awareness recognition that no self is something that you're still looking at, you can continue that. You can start dealing with some of the body stuff because I think it's going to come anyway, whether you like it or not. And I tell people, is like, get started early with that, because if not, it can come and slap you in ways that you can't imagine if you don't. And I'm not just saying that. I mean, I've seen it through the years. I have seen it over and over and over. One-on-one sessions through the years. Is people thought that certain things just weren't important on the path because they were either interpreting the teachings or the teachings would lead them to think that there isn't anything other important. Like almost like it doesn't matter whether there's still an addiction there after you realize, or you die of cancer, that has nothing to do with this, or your chronic pain is just physical. Now we're learning that's not the case. See, and I've known that, but when the science there, and then to develop KI in a way that I feel really verifies that first and second door. Well, that's just good, actually. And that's good. That's what makes me feel so good about this work. And because when you're walking around Earth in one degree or another, unaware of your emotional, mental, egoic operating system, whether it's conscious to you or not, is some form of suffering, even if it's just chronic pain. It's still, chronic pain is a lot to endure, especially when it becomes severe, or illness. So these things matter, in my view. This embodiment conversation really does matter to the human experience. And if people would say, well, what does the human experience matter? Isn't the whole point to see that there's no self? There is no individual human. The thing is, that is not the whole point. Because that's, as far as I can see, that's always been the case. That there actually hasn't been a self behind all of this. And of course, we've believed that we've believed in separation. I get that. But it hasn't been the case that there is a self, actually, if it were being investigated, or separation isn't real in the way that it looks if it were being investigated. If that happens here on Earth, that doesn't mean that we're all going to sit around in satsang and point back to each other how there's no self, because it's always been the case. And now we've just recognized it. Okay, there is no we, if you want to look at it in non-dual terms. But once that's recognized, we still have work to do here on Earth, because we're still embodied in this lifetime. And so some people will listen to what I'm saying and say, none of that matters, Scott, because there is no self. You didn't hear what I said. That's always been the case. The fact that we recognize it, we still, in a relative, on the level of form, we're here, apparently, on this earth together. with other creatures apparently in life, and maybe even other civilizations on other planets on the level of form. So we have work to do. It's in some ways the spiritual path is rightfully selfish, rightfully, because one has to focus on one's experience to see through the matrix of suffering. Because if you don't, you end up spending your life really focused on self, focused on me, and not we, or what's going on in the world, or my neighbor, or my family. A lot of us in spirituality, we do isolate, and not all of us, but you know what I mean by that. We do. So what I'm saying is, this is all very relevant, because spirituality has, I think, been about, partially in some circles, have been about divorcing itself from life. Somehow that, I don't know how it's not applicable or practical. To me, it's absolutely applicable to life. Not absolutely. It's a big word. But now that we're seeing these things like Sarno and Gordon, how is that not applicable to our life? How are these things not applicable to awakening too? As we know, this is our own consciousness. And so I did this for a while during my investigation. When I say I just, you know what I mean. It's not an ego brag. I'm just sharing. And I have to say that because people will say, I heard you say I. I say it all the time. When I was doing that investigation, a big part of it was really seeing that nothing can be experienced apart from awareness. I mean, all the way to China or other planets, I can't know any of those objects except via my own consciousness, or via awareness, I should say, which is the words and pictures and feelings and sensations that appear, which present that object to me, or those objects. And I really took that investigation deeply. So if that's the case, that nothing that's appearing in one's reality is really apart from one's awareness, and all of the thoughts and feelings and sensations are not even separate from the objects that you're seeing out there in the world, then this is really relevant to bring the world and awareness together and see them as not two, and to see that these are doorways for us. Because as we stop making spirituality just about the formlessness or the awareness that's divorced from life, we stop just making about that. There's that aspect of experience. There's also the form. There's the appearances, the relative, and within that, it's all one. Because what Sarno and Gordon are saying, and just that line of thinking, first door, second door, is that a lot of what's going on in our world is because we haven't investigated skillfully our own experience enough. And if we investigate it and we see that the inside and the outside are one, and that the trauma and the other stuff that I'm holding in my body corresponds to the objects that I'm seeing in the world, and my own suffering with those objects and people, and if we really see that, it would be transformative. But if we keep making spirituality about just formlessness, there's no self, there's no nothing, then we're creating a massive split between that and our actual life. And I think this is the bridge for me, the embodiment. Because as you go in and you start to deal with some of these issues, then the healing of that, or the resolution of that, manifests on the level of form, relationship. Because these things matter. We're not only just on the topic of healing, which matters in human life, but also when we do this work in the unconscious, the transformation that we experience within, so to speak, because there is no within and without, manifests in our life, in our relationship. Anger repression is a thing in our relationships. Trauma is playing itself out in our relationships. These things in our body, shame in our body, is playing itself out in our relationships. Spirituality can try to divorce itself from all of that, but then it would have to divorce itself from body, and then it divorces itself from all form. And then this investigation can never happen, this deepening, this seeing where all the walls of separation break down, even ultimately between what we're saying is awareness and manifestation, life. There's a lot to behold there. And why would we want to stop on the path? Anyway, or stop at our places where we just put our flag in the ground and say, that's it. I don't care what Scott Killaby says. I'm having fun, guys. I've been talking a lot lately, but there's a lot of deep silence and peace. In the midst of all of that, isn't that the beauty? Is when, do you want the deep silence and peace when it's only available outside of all the things and forms? Or do you want a deep peace and abiding that is there in the midst of that interfacing with the world? To me, I'll take door number 2. Sorry for the pun there. Thank you all for being with me.